California sun beat down on Naval amphibious base Coronado, its rays glinting off the pristine blue waters of the Pacific. The base hummed with activity. Young recruits in training gear ran in formation along the beachfront. Officers barked commands that echoed across the parade grounds. In the distance, the rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors punctuated the salt-laden air. Amid this martial symphony, Thomas Reeves knelt in a small garden patch near the SEAL training compound. At 84 years old, his body bore the hallmarks of a life lived hard. His skin, weathered by decades of sun and sea, had the texture of well-worn leather. His hands, now gently patting soil around marigold seedlings, were gnarled with arthritis, yet moved with the practiced precision of someone accustomed to delicate work. Despite his age, his posture remained remarkably straight, a habit ingrained through decades of military discipline. Thomas wore faded work clothes, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. On his left forearm, barely visible through years of fading as a tattoo, it resembled a crude drawing of a seal clutching a trident. The lines had blurred with time, the once black ink now a ghostly blue-gray that seemed to belong to another lifetime. The sound of approaching footsteps and young male laughter pulled Thomas from his quiet concentration. Three men in their 20s, heads freshly shaved and bodies carved from months of punishing physical training, swaggered toward the garden area. They were SEAL candidates, identifiable by the confident yet slightly desperate energy that radiated from them. Their expressions carried the particular brand of arrogance unique to those who had survived Hell Week but had yet to earn their tridents. The tallest of the three, a muscular specimen with piercing blue eyes and a square jaw that belonged on a recruiting poster, nudged his companions and nodded toward Thomas. "Check out Grandpa's ink," he said, voice pitched deliberately loud enough to carry. "I've seen better art on bathroom walls." His companions laughed on cue. The sound was sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of the base. Thomas continued his work, seemingly oblivious to their presence. The leader stepped closer, casting his shadow over the flower bed. The name tape on his uniform read, "Collins." "Is that supposed to be a SEAL with a fork, old-timer?" Collins asked, bending slightly to get a better look at the faded tattoo. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You were a cook in the SEAL division." More laughter followed. A small crowd of junior sailors began to form at a respectful distance, drawn by the confrontation but hesitant to intervene. Thomas methodically continued his work, transferring another seedling from a plastic tray to the prepared soil. Collins, emboldened by the audience, and Thomas's silence, pressed further. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial sneer. "Come on, Gramps. Don't be shy. We just want to hear the war story that goes with your little doodle. Or did you get it on a drunken weekend in Tijuana?" Thomas finally looked up. His eyes, pale blue and watery with age, held no anger or fear. They were set deep in a web of wrinkles that mapped a lifetime of squinting against sun and sea spray. His gaze seemed to look right through Collins, as if seeing something far beyond the young recruit. "It's just a memory, son," Thomas said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, quiet but clear in the salty air. The simple, non-confrontational reply seemed to irritate Collins further. His confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening into something more deliberate. "A memory," Collins scoffed, raising his voice for the benefit of the growing audience. "A memory of what forgetting to order the ketchup. This is a base for warriors, people who have earned the right to be here." He reached out and poked Thomas's tattooed arm with a thick finger. "This kindergarten art is an insult to the real inking on this base." He gestured to his own arm, where a professionally done tattoo of an eagle clutching an anchor was visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. Thomas remained silent, his breathing, even his gaze, now distant. As Collins continued his tirade, Thomas's mind drifted to another beach, another lifetime ago. The frigid waters off Incheon, Korea. September 15th, 1950. The sky was still dark, the air thick with tension, and the acrid smell of cordite. 19-year-old Thomas Reeves felt the cold seep through his wetsuit as he moved through chest-deep water toward the beach. Around him, 11 other men from Underwater Demolition Team 3 advanced silently, each carrying explosives. Their mission cleared the beach obstacles before the main landing force arrived at dawn. Mines, barbed wire, and concrete dragon's teeth waited to tear apart landing craft. North Korean defenders would open fire the moment they were spotted. Young Thomas signaled to his team with hand gestures, pointing out a line of mines visible just beneath the water's surface. The team split up, moving with practiced efficiency despite the numbing cold. Thomas reached the first mine, securing a small Mk-13 Mod 0 demo charge to its base. His hands moved steadily, despite the danger. Despite knowing that a single mistake meant death, automatic weapons fire suddenly erupted from the shoreline. Bullets slapped into the water around them. Thomas kept working, fingers moving by touch alone as he primed the charge. To his right, McAllister struggled with his equipment, hands trembling from cold and fear. Thomas finished his charge and moved to help McAllister, whose mind was dangerously close to a potential trigger mechanism. Thomas pushed McAllister's hands away, taking over with calm precision even as bullets zipped past their heads. Seconds later, both charges were set. Thomas pulled McAllister down into deeper water as the first light of dawn revealed their position to the Korean defenders. The memory faded as Collins's voice cut through the fog of history. "I think maybe you're lost," Collins was saying, his tone laced with theatrical disdain. "The senior center is 5 miles north." Thomas looked down at his hands. Despite the years, they still bore the calluses of a working man. The dirt beneath his fingernails now came from garden soil rather than battlefield grime, but these were still the hands that had once disarmed explosives under enemy fire, that had dragged wounded comrades to safety, that had taken lives when necessary. The junior petty officer, who should have been intervening, hovered at the edge of the crowd, clearly intimidated by the SEAL candidates and unwilling to risk their wrath. The standoff continued, Collins and his friends puffing their chests, while Thomas remained preternaturally calm. Collins, misinterpreting Thomas's stillness as fear or senility, decided to escalate. He grabbed Thomas's worn canvas bag of gardening tools from the ground beside him. "Maybe we should check your ID, make sure you're even supposed to be here." He made a show of rummaging through the bag, pulling out a small trowel, a pair of gloves, and a tarnished silver thermos. He held up the thermos, shaking it next to his ear. "What's in here, Grandpa? Prune juice?" The crowd's laughter had taken on a nervous edge. This had gone beyond casual hazing into something uglier. Still, Thomas did not react. He simply watched Collins with that same unreadable expression. Across the quad, partially obscured by a large palm tree, Master Chief Sullivan observed the scene. Sullivan was a 20-year Navy veteran with salt and pepper hair cropped close to his scalp and the compact build of someone who had never stopped training. He had been heading to the administration building when the commotion caught his attention. His first instinct was to march over and tear into the recruits, but something about the old man's bearing gave him pause. There was something familiar about the weathered face, about the quiet dignity with which he endured the mockery. Sullivan squinted, focusing on the faded tattoo that Collins was ridiculing. A seal with a trident. Not the modern SEAL trident insignia, but something older, cruder, almost primitive in its design. Sullivan's blood ran cold as recognition dawned. He had seen a sketch of that symbol once years ago in classified documents about the precursors to the Navy SEALs. Sullivan looked more closely at the old man's face, at the set of his jaw, at the watchful eyes that seemed to miss nothing. A name surfaced from the depths of Sullivan's memory, a legend whispered about by instructors during his own training. It couldn't be. Sullivan didn't walk toward the confrontation. Instead, he turned and moved briskly away, pulling out his phone. The crowd saw him leave, and some sagged with disappointment, assuming another authority figure was choosing not to get involved. They were wrong. Sullivan was not retreating. He was escalating to a level they couldn't possibly imagine. He found the number for Captain Anderson's personal aide and pressed the call button, his heart pounding against his ribs. "This is Master Chief Sullivan," he said, voice low and urgent. "Get me the captain. Now." There was sputtering on the other end of the line. "Master Chief, he's in his quarterly command brief with Admiral Richardson. I don't care if he's in a meeting with the Secretary of the Navy," Sullivan cut in his tone, leaving no room for argument. "You tell Captain Anderson that he needs to get down to the SEAL training ground right now." He paused, then added, "Tell him it's about Thomas Reeves." A pause, then a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Thomas Reeves, are you sure?" Sullivan glanced back over his shoulder. He could see Collins now trying to physically pull the old man to his feet. "I'm looking right at him," Sullivan confirmed grimly. "And he's about to be assaulted by 3 SEAL candidates who don't know they're poking a sleeping giant. Get him down here, now." While Sullivan was making the call, Collins had grown tired of getting no reaction from Thomas. He grabbed the old man by his thin bicep, his fingers digging into wiry muscle that was surprisingly firm. "All right, Grandpa, show's over," Collins announced, trying to haul Thomas to his feet. "Let's get you to base security. They can figure out which nursing home you escaped from." The act of putting hands on him crossed a final line. Thomas didn't resist. He allowed himself to be pulled upward, his joints creaking in protest. But for the first time, a flicker of something other than patience appeared in his eyes. It was cold fire, an ancient and dangerous look that lasted only an instant before being carefully shuttered. It was a look that said he had calculated precisely how much force would be needed to drop Collins where he stood, and was actively choosing not to employ it. In the administration building a quarter-mile away, Captain James Anderson was midway through his quarterly briefing when his aide burst through the door without knocking. The young lieutenant's face was pale, his eyes wide with urgency. "Sir," he stammered, "Master Chief Sullivan is on the line. He says it's an emergency." The lieutenant swallowed hard before adding, "He said to tell you it's about Thomas Reeves." The name fell into the room like a depth charge. Admiral Richardson, who had been reviewing budget projections on a tablet, looked up sharply. Captain Anderson froze mid-sentence. "Thomas Reeves." Anderson repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper. Admiral Richardson set down his tablet with deliberate care. "James," he said quietly, "if Sullivan is talking about who I think he is, you need to take that call." Anderson was already moving, snatching the phone from his aide's hand. "Sullivan, talk to me." He listened for no more than 10 seconds, his expression morphing from disbelief to shock to cold, controlled fury. "He's where, with who?" Anderson's knuckles whitened around the phone. "I'm on my way. Alert the command staff. I want every officer in dress uniform at the training ground in 5 minutes." He ended the call and turned to Admiral Richardson. "Sir, it appears Thomas Reeves is on base, and he's being harassed by SEAL candidates who think the original Foxhole Alpha insignia is a joke." Richardson was on his feet instantly, his face draining of color. "Thomas Reeves is alive, here." The Admiral's voice held something Anderson had never heard before, awe. "Apparently he's been working as a groundskeeper, sir." Richardson was already striding toward the door, adjusting his uniform jacket as he moved. "Your vehicle, Captain?" "Now." Back at the garden, the confrontation had reached a breaking point. Collins had pulled Thomas to his feet and was holding his arm, treating him like a trespasser. The old man stood calmly, making no move to resist, but also showing no fear. His eyes, moments ago distant and unfocused, had sharpened with a clarity that made some of the onlookers take an instinctive step back. "What's this?" Collins had found something in the canvas bag, something that made him pause. He pulled out an old, worn leather case. Inside was a faded military ID card so old that its format was unfamiliar to most of the young sailors present. Collins stared at it, brow furrowed in confusion. "This can't be real," he said, but with less certainty than before. "This says you were in Underwater Demolition Team 3 in 1950. He looked up at Thomas, suspicion warring with the first glimmer of doubt. "That would make you, what, 84? Thomas corrected quietly. "I was 19 when I joined UDT. Before your father was born, I'd imagine." Collins sneered, but it seemed forced now. "So you were a frogman wannabe. That doesn't explain this stupid SEAL doodle." He jabbed a finger at Thomas's tattoo again. "The real SEAL trident looks nothing like this amateur hour sketch." Thomas merely watched him, saying nothing, allowing Collins to continue digging his own grave. The young recruit's companions were growing uncomfortable, sensing that something about the situation had shifted. "You know what, I'm going to report you for stolen valor," Collins declared, pulling out his smartphone. "Let me take a picture of this fake ID and your little tattoo. The VFW guys will have a field day with this." He raised his phone to take a photo of Thomas's arm. And that's when they all heard its sirens. Not the familiar whoop-whoop of base police, but the piercing, authoritative wail of command vehicles. Heads turned toward the sound as it grew louder, closer, multiplying. Then they appeared, a convoy of black SUVs and official Navy sedans, lights flashing, screeching to a halt on the access road bordering the training ground. They surrounded the area in a formidable semicircle, cutting off all escape routes. The doors flew open with military precision. Captain Anderson emerged first, resplendent in his service dress, white ribbons, and insignia gleaming in the afternoon sun. His face was a thundercloud of controlled rage. Behind him came Admiral Richardson, 4 stars glittering on his collar, followed by a wave of officers and senior enlisted personnel, all in dress uniform. The air crackled with sudden, immense pressure. The laughter and jeering died instantly, replaced by confused, terrified silence. The SEAL candidates, including Collins, froze mid-posture. Their arrogance evaporated like morning fog, replaced by the primal fear of recruits caught in the crosshairs of the highest levels of command. Collins's hand, still gripping Thomas's arm, suddenly felt like it was touching a live wire. He let go as if burned, snapping to attention with such force that his spine audibly popped. The assembled officers parted like the Red Sea as Admiral Richardson strode through their midst. He didn't look at Collins or the other recruits. He didn't acknowledge the stunned onlookers. His eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to make the very air shimmer, locked on one person, and one person only, Thomas Reeves. Richardson came to a halt precisely 3 feet in front of the elderly man. For a moment, there was complete silence across the training ground. Even the distant sounds of the base seemed to have been muted by the gravity of the moment. Then, in a movement so sharp and precise, it seemed to cut the air, Admiral Richardson snapped to the most perfect ramrod straight salute of his entire decorated career. It was a gesture of such profound, unadulterated respect that it sent a shockwave through the crowd. "Chief Petty Officer Reeves," the Admiral's voice boomed clear and resonant, stripped of all anger, and filled only with a deep, humbling reverence. "It is an honor to have you on our base, sir. I offer my deepest, most sincere apology for the reception you have received from our men." He held the salute arm, rigid gaze locked forward. The recruits stared, their minds utterly failing to process what was happening. The highest-ranking officer on the base was saluting a groundskeeper. Admiral Richardson turned his head slightly, his eyes falling upon Collins and the other two candidates, who were now visibly trembling. His voice dropped an octave but lost none of its carrying power. "You three," he said quietly, the words landing like artillery shells. "Do you see this man? Do you see this tattoo you found so amusing?" He didn't wait for an answer. His words became a history lesson, delivered with the force of a battering ram. "This is Thomas Reeves. He wasn't a cook." Richardson's voice took on a cadence, each sentence a hammer blow. "Before there were even SEALs, this man was a frogman in the underwater demolition teams. He hit the beaches at Incheon when your grandfathers were still in diapers." Collins had gone pale, his eyes darting between the Admiral and the old man who stood calmly before them. When this nation needed men to do the impossible, he was one of the founding members of a unit so classified that for decades the official record said it never existed. Richardson's gaze drifted to the faded ink on Thomas's arm. "This seal with a fork, as you so cleverly called it, is not a joke. It is the original hand-drawn insignia for Foxhole Alpha, the most elite special operations unit of the Korean War and the Cold War. A unit so effective they were known only as ghosts to their targets." The crowd was utterly silent, hanging on every word. The weight of 70 years of hidden history descended upon that small patch of grass and flowers. "This man," Richardson continued, his voice thick with emotion, "wrote the book we all live by. He didn't literally write it. He forged it with his actions, in mud and blood and frozen seas. The SEAL ethos that you recite, that you pretend to understand, is based on declassified reports of his missions. He is not a relic. He is the foundation upon which this entire command is built." Thomas, who had stood patiently through the entire speech, slowly raised a weathered hand and gave a gentle, dismissive wave toward the Admiral, a silent, "at ease." His expression was one of mild embarrassment, as if he were an intensely private man suddenly thrust under a spotlight. "It was a long time ago, Admiral," Thomas said, his quiet voice a stark contrast to Richardson's ringing declaration. "A different world." Admiral Richardson slowly, reluctantly dropped his salute. He then turned his full, undivided attention to Collins and his two companions. The temperature on the training ground seemed to drop by 20 degrees. His voice was no longer loud, but a lethal, controlled whisper that was infinitely more menacing. "You are candidates to join an elite brotherhood. You are supposed to be the best this nation has to offer. The very first principle of that brotherhood is honor. The second is respect. You have shown neither." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "You stood here on grounds sanctified by the men who came before you, and you mistook quiet dignity for weakness. You mistook age for irrelevance. You dishonored yourselves. You dishonored the uniform you hoped to wear. And you dishonored a man to whom every single one of us owes a debt that can never be repaid." He let the words hang in the air for a long, brutal moment. As of this moment, your candidacies for basic underwater demolitions or SEAL training are suspended pending a full review by me personally. Report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. Now get out of my sight. The three recruits, faces pale with shock and shame, mumbled, "Yes, sir," and practically fled. The eyes of the entire crowd followed them like burning spotlights. As they were led away, Thomas stepped forward and put a gentle hand on Admiral Richardson's arm. "They're just kids, Admiral," he said softly, "full of fire and vinegar. We were the same once." He turned his gaze to the remaining crowd of young sailors. "Pride is a heavy anchor," he said, his voice carrying surprisingly well across the now silent training ground. "It can hold you steady in a storm, or it can drag you straight to the bottom. The trick is knowing which it's doing." His words, simple and delivered without a trace of malice, settled over the crowd like gentle rain. It was a lesson, not a condemnation, offered freely from a place of deep and hard-won wisdom. As Thomas spoke those words, the California sun seemed to flicker for a moment. In the mind's eye, it gave way to the cold, gray light of a military bunker hidden beneath the Alaskan permafrost. A much younger Thomas Reeves, no older than Collins, sat at a rough wooden table in a classified facility on Kodiak Island. The year was 1952, and the Cold War was freezing over. Thomas, by then a decorated veteran of Korea, had been summoned along with 8 other exceptional UDT operators. The room was Spartan, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everyone in a sickly pallor. A stern captain with intelligence insignia spread photographs across the table. Soviet naval installations, border outposts, missile test sites. "Gentlemen," the captain said, "what I'm about to tell you doesn't exist. The unit I'm offering you a place in doesn't exist. The missions you'll undertake never happened. Are we clear?" 9 heads nodded in unison. "We're creating something new. Covert maritime operators with advanced infiltration training. You'll go where others can't, gather what others won't, and if necessary, eliminate what others shouldn't." He tapped the photos. "The Russians have their frogmen. We need something better." Young Thomas studied the images, mentally calculating approaches, escape routes, tactical options. The captain continued outlining the program: extreme cold weather, training, advanced demolitions, foreign language immersion, hand-to-hand combat systems from Asia that few Americans had ever seen. "We're calling it Project Foxhole Alpha," the captain concluded. "You'll operate in 3-man teams. Completely deniable. Even the Navy will disavow knowledge if you're caught." Later that night, Thomas and his 2 assigned teammates, Carlos Mendez and Franklin White, huddled in their barracks. They were forming a bond that would need to be unbreakable, forged in the knowledge that they would soon depend entirely on each other. "We need something," White had said, sketching on a scrap of paper, "something that marks us as brothers." His pencil moved across the paper, drawing a sleek seal holding a trident. "We're hunters in the deep," he explained. "Silent, deadly, guardians of the threshold." Young Thomas smiled at the crude but powerful image. "The Foxhole Alpha seal," he said, approving. "When we finish training, we get this inked. A promise between us." Mendez, always practical, added, "A promise that we all come home, no matter what." None of them could have known then that keeping that promise would demand sacrifices beyond imagination. Nor could they have known that 70 years later, that simple drawing would be at the center of a confrontation that would expose their hidden legacy to a new generation. The memory faded, returning Thomas to the present moment. Admiral Richardson was speaking quietly with Captain Anderson, arranging for Thomas to be escorted to officers' quarters rather than returning to his modest groundskeeper's residence. Thomas shook his head firmly. "Thank you, Admiral, but I'll stay in my own quarters. I've kept a low profile for a reason." Richardson looked like he wanted to argue, but recognized the steel behind the gentle refusal. "At least join us for dinner tonight, Chief Reeves. There are people who should meet you." Thomas nodded his acceptance of this compromise. As the officers began to disperse, he knelt again by his flower bed, returning to his interrupted work as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The young sailors lingered, watching with new eyes as the legend calmly planted marigolds in the California sun. One by one they approached, offered respectful nods, and drifted away, carrying with them the beginning of a story that would soon spread throughout the Navy. In the distance, Collins and his friends were still visible, walking with slumped shoulders toward an uncertain future. They didn't yet know that their greatest lesson was just beginning, or that the old man they had mocked would become central to their understanding of what it truly meant to serve. The sirens had fallen silent, but their echo remained a harbinger of change that would soon sweep through the entire training program. And in his humble garden, Thomas Reeves continued his patient work, tending to new life with the same careful attention he had once given to far deadlier matters. No one could see the memories playing behind his calm eyes, or know how many ghosts kept him company as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the Pacific horizon. The sirens wailed across Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, their piercing cries slicing through the afternoon air. Heads turned toward the sound as it grew louder, multiplying in intensity. The crowd around Thomas Reeves and Collins parted instinctively, sensing the approach of significant authority. A convoy of black SUVs and official Navy sedans appeared, emergency lights, flashing tires squealing as they formed a semicircle around the training area. The vehicles came to an abrupt halt, doors flying open with practiced precision. First to emerge was Captain Anderson, his dress whites immaculate in the California sun. His face was carved from granite, eyes narrowed with controlled fury. Behind him came a taller figure, ramrod straight, despite being in his 60s, 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder board. Admiral Richardson had arrived, and the very air seemed to crackle with his authority. A dozen senior officers followed, all in formal dress uniform, forming a phalanx of brass and tradition. The scene was unprecedented. For many of the young sailors watching this, was the first time they had seen the base's entire command staff assembled outside of a formal ceremony. Collins still stood with his hand on Thomas's arm, frozen in the sudden spotlight. His face drained of color as he recognized the insignia on Richardson's collar. His companions took small steps backward, as if hoping to disappear into the gathering crowd. Admiral Richardson strode forward, parting the sea of onlookers without a word. His eyes never left Thomas, ignoring Collins entirely, as if he were beneath notice. The Admiral came to a stop precisely 3 feet from Thomas, his posture military perfect. Then, in a movement so sharp and precise, it seemed to slice the very air, Richardson snapped to attention and rendered the most flawless salute of his decorated career. He held it unwavering, his voice resonating across the now silent training ground. "Chief Petty Officer Reeves," the Admiral said, each word weighted with profound respect. "It is an honor to have you on our base, sir. I offer my deepest, most sincere apology for the reception you have received from our men." The crowd stared in stunned silence. Collins's hand fell away from Thomas's arm as if burned. The young recruit's face contorted in confusion and dawning horror. Thomas stood calmly, weathered and slight, beside the imposing Admiral, yet somehow the more commanding presence. He gave a small nod and raised a hand in the casual acknowledgement of someone long accustomed to military courtesy. "At ease, Admiral," he said softly. "No harm done." Admiral Richardson held the salute a moment longer before lowering his arm with reluctance. He turned his gaze toward Collins and his companions, who snapped to attention with such force their bodies practically vibrated. "You three," Richardson began, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried farther than a shout. "Do you have any idea who you've been harassing?" Collins swallowed visibly. "No, sir," he managed. Richardson's eyes narrowed. "This is Thomas Reeves." The name hung in the air like a revelation. Before there were SEALs, he was a frogman with Underwater Demolition Team 3. He hit the beaches at Incheon when your grandfathers were still in diapers. The Admiral stepped closer to Collins, his voice intensifying. "When this country needed men who could do the impossible, he was selected for Foxhole Alpha, the most elite special operations unit of the Korean War in the Cold War era. A unit so effective they were known only as ghosts to their enemies." Richardson's gaze drifted to the faded tattoo on Thomas's arm. "That seal with a fork, as you so cleverly called it, is not a joke. It is the original hand-drawn insignia of the unit that wrote the blueprint for every special operations tactic you're attempting to learn." The crowd had grown larger, sailors and officers alike, drawn by the commotion and the unprecedented presence of command staff in the training area. They listened in rapt attention as decades of classified history were suddenly laid bare. "This man," Richardson continued, emotion thickening his voice, "is the foundation upon which this entire command is built. The SEAL ethos you recite, that you pretend to understand, was forged by his actions in mud and blood and frozen seas." Thomas stood quietly, his expression one of mild embarrassment at being the center of such attention. His eyes, however, remained alert, taking in every face in the crowd, noting every reaction with the practiced observation of someone who had once depended on such skills for survival. Admiral Richardson finally turned to Collins and his companions, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. As of this moment, your candidacies for basic underwater demolition or SEAL training are suspended pending review. Report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. He leaned closer. Now get out of my sight. The three recruits stammered acknowledgments and practically fled shoulders hunched, as if expecting physical blows to follow. The crowd watched them go, then returned their attention to the elderly man and the four-star admiral standing in incongruous tableau amid the marigold bed. Thomas looked at the flower he had been planting when the confrontation began. With methodical care, he knelt and returned to patting soil around its base as if the interruption had been nothing more than a passing shower. "They're just kids, Admiral," he said without looking up, his voice carrying in the hushed atmosphere. "Full of fire and vinegar. We were the same once." Richardson's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Not quite the same, Chief." Thomas glanced up, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered features. "No, I seem to recall a young lieutenant named Richardson who once called my generation obsolete anchors during a tactical review in '85. A ripple of quickly suppressed laughter moved through the crowd. Admiral Richardson's ears reddened slightly, but he allowed a small smile. "Point taken, Chief Reeves." Captain Anderson stepped forward. "Sir, we've prepared officers' quarters for you. Please allow us to—" Thomas waved him off gently. "Thank you, Captain, but I'll stay in my own quarters. I've kept a low profile for a reason." He glanced around at the assembled brass and the watching crowd. "Though I suppose that's shot to hell now." Richardson nodded in understanding. "At least join us for dinner tonight, Chief. There are people who should meet you." "That I can do," Thomas agreed. As the command staff began to disperse, giving orders to restore normal operations, Thomas's mind drifted back to another time, another place. The cold waters of the Bering Sea, 1952. A classified facility buried in the Alaskan wilderness on Kodiak Island. Young Thomas Reeves sat in a Spartan briefing room with 8 other men selected from the underwater demolition teams. Steam rose from metal mugs of black coffee as they listened to a gray-haired captain, with intelligence insignia, outline what would become their new existence. "Gentlemen," the captain said, spreading photographs across a battered table, "what I'm about to tell you doesn't exist. The unit I'm offering you a place in doesn't exist. The missions you'll undertake never happened." 9 heads nodded in unison, understanding perfectly. "The Soviets are expanding their submarine capabilities. They're building installations in places we can't monitor through conventional means." He tapped one of the photos showing a distant northern coastline. "We need men who can go where others can't, gather what others won't, and if necessary, eliminate what others shouldn't." Young Thomas studied the images, mentally calculating the approaches, escape routes, tactical options. The captain continued outlining the program: extreme cold water training, advanced demolitions, specialized communications, hand-to-hand combat systems few Americans had ever seen. "We're calling it Project Foxhole Alpha. You'll operate in 3-man teams. Completely deniable. Even the Navy will disavow knowledge if you're caught." Later that night, Thomas and his 2 assigned teammates, Carlos Mendez and Franklin White, huddled in their barracks, forming a bond that would need to be unbreakable. "We need something," White said, sketching on a scrap of paper, "something that marks us as brothers." His pencil moved across the paper, drawing a sleek seal holding a trident. "We're hunters in the deep, silent, deadly, guardians of the threshold." Young Thomas smiled at the crude but powerful image. "The Foxhole Alpha seal," he said, approving. "When we finish training, we get this inked. A promise between us." Mendez, always practical, added, "A promise that we all come home, no matter what." The memory dissolved as Thomas became aware of someone standing nearby. He looked up to find a young petty officer waiting respectfully. "Chief Reeves, sir," the sailor said. "Admiral Richardson asked me to escort you wherever you'd like to go." Thomas rose slowly, knees protesting after so long kneeling in the garden. "I'd like to finish planting these marigolds, son. Then I need to clean up before this dinner." The petty officer looked uncertain, clearly torn between the Admiral's orders and the simple request. "I can help with the flowers, sir," he offered finally. Thomas nodded, handing him a trowel. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes, the young sailor occasionally stealing glances at the legendary figure beside him. "Go ahead," Thomas said eventually. "You can ask." The sailor hesitated. Sir, is it true what they say about Foxhole Alpha, that your team infiltrated a Soviet submarine base in '62? Thomas continued planting his expression, giving nothing away. History's a funny thing, son. What's classified and what's just a sea story tend to blur together after enough time passes. He patted soil around another seedling. But I will say this, there are still some pages in the history books that won't be declassified until long after I'm gone. Across the base in the Admiral's office, Richardson sat behind his desk, looking at a confidential file that few people had authorization to access. Captain Anderson stood by the window, gazing out at the training grounds in the distance. I thought he was dead, Anderson said quietly. All the records indicated he died in '98. Richardson nodded slowly. That was by design. After White was killed in the Gulf, Reeves wanted to disappear. He closed the file. Did you know he's been working here as a groundskeeper for 15 years, living in base housing under his real name, and not one person recognized him or made the connection? Until today, Anderson noted. Until today, Richardson agreed. He tapped the file thoughtfully. Do you know what we called him back in the day, Night Eagle? Because he could see in the dark what others missed in broad daylight. Anderson turned from the window. What do we do about Collins and the others? That's the question, isn't it? Richardson leaned back in his chair. Technically, they've committed an offense serious enough for immediate dismissal from the program. But Reeves was right. They're just kids. Arrogant, disrespectful kids, but still kids. Richardson's expression hardened. However, they need to understand the gravity of what they did. There needs to be consequence in education both. Back at the garden, Thomas had finished planting the marigolds. He stood slowly brushing soil from his knees and thanked the young petty officer for his help. I'd like to go to my quarters now, he said. I believe the Admiral expects me at 1800 hours. Yes, sir, I'll escort you. They walked across the base, drawing curious glances from personnel who had already heard rumors of the confrontation. Word traveled fast in the closed ecosystem of a military installation. By evening, there wouldn't be a sailor on base who hadn't heard some version of what had happened. As they walked, Thomas noticed Collins and his two friends being dressed down by their training instructor, a muscular chief petty officer whose voice carried across the parade ground. The three recruits stood at rigid attention, faces forward, accepting their verbal lashing without response. Thomas paused, watching the scene with a considering expression. Sir, the escort asked, noticing his hesitation. A moment, Thomas said. He changed direction, heading toward the group. The instructor saw him coming and immediately fell silent, snapping to attention. As you were chief, Thomas said, I'd like a word with Recruit Collins, if I may. The instructor nodded. Of course, sir. He turned to Collins. You heard the man. Collins stepped forward, his face a mask of misery and shame. He stopped before Thomas' eyes fixed at a point somewhere over the old man's shoulder, unable to meet his gaze. Sir, he said, voice tight, I want to apologize for... Thomas raised a hand, stopping him. Walk with me. They moved away from the others toward a quieter area near the edge of the parade ground. Thomas was silent for several paces, gathering his thoughts. You know what the hardest thing about being young is, Collins? He finally asked. Collins, clearly surprised by the question, hesitated. No, sir. It's believing you have something to prove. Thomas looked at the younger man directly. Tell me why you want to be a SEAL. Collins swallowed hard. I want to be the best, sir, to serve my country at the highest level. Admirable, Thomas nodded, but incomplete. The best at what killing, surviving. There are plenty of natural killers and survivors who make terrible warriors. Collins had no answer. Thomas continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing hard-earned wisdom. A true warrior isn't defined by how many enemies he defeats, but by how many brothers he saves. The old man's eyes grew distant, seeing beyond the present moment. In 1970, we were running an extraction operation in the Arabian Sea, intelligence on a new Soviet submarine detection system. The mission went sideways. We were compromised, taking heavy fire. Collins listened intently, aware he was hearing something few ever would. Mendez took a bullet in the thigh, severed his femoral artery. White was providing covering fire while I worked to stop the bleeding. Then White went down, captured. Thomas paused, the memory still painful after so many decades. I had to make a choice, try to save Mendez, who was bleeding out, or go after White immediately. The bass sounds faded away as Collins was drawn into the story, seeing it play out in his mind's eye. I got Mendez stabilized and to our extraction point. Then I went back for White. Thomas's voice grew softer. Alone, against orders, into a facility with 17 armed hostiles. Did you get him out, sir? Collins asked quietly. Thomas was silent for a long moment. I got him out, he finally said, but not alive. They'd already executed him. I still brought him home, though, because that was our promise to each other back when we got these. He touched the faded tattoo. We all come home, no matter what. Collins stared at the ground, processing what he'd heard. I'm not telling you this to impress you, Thomas said. I'm telling you because you need to understand what that tattoo really means. It's not about being a badass, it's about sacrifice, about putting the mission and your brothers above yourself. He fixed Collins with a penetrating stare. So I'll ask again, why do you want to be a SEAL? Collins met the old man's eyes for the first time. I don't know anymore, sir, he admitted. I thought I did, but... Thomas nodded, satisfied with the honest uncertainty. Good, that's a start. He gestured toward the training grounds. Now go back and take whatever punishment they give you. Learn from it. And when you figure out the right answer to my question, maybe you'll be ready. Collins straightened. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As Collins rejoined his friends and their instructor, Thomas continued to his quarters, his thoughts drifting once again to the past. To a frozen night in the Bering Sea, to the Soviet naval facility at Petropavlovsk, to the first time he had realized what it truly meant to be part of Foxhole Alpha. That evening, dressed in civilian clothes that had been pressed and prepared with military precision, Thomas made his way to the officers' mess. His escort, the same young petty officer from earlier, stood a respectful distance away, ready to guide him, but not hovering. The mess had been transformed. Tables arranged in a formal configuration, white linens, the Navy's best silverware. A dozen senior officers waited standing at attention as Thomas entered. Admiral Richardson approached, offering his hand. Chief Reeves, thank you for joining us. Thomas shook the proffered hand, noting the subtle shift in address. Not sir anymore, but the respectful acknowledgement of his actual rank. Richardson was calibrating, finding the balance between honoring a legend and respecting Thomas's preference for minimal fuss. Thank you for the invitation, Admiral, Thomas replied, though this seems like quite a production for an old frogman. Richardson smiled slightly. Not just any frogman. He gestured toward the assembled officers. Most of these men have studied operations attributed to Foxhole Alpha. They've been implementing tactics you pioneered without ever knowing your name. Thomas glanced around the room, recognizing the hunger for history in their eyes. These were career officers, students of naval warfare, suddenly confronted with a living link to classified operations they had only read about in heavily redacted reports. Well, Thomas said pragmatically, I suppose there's no putting the cat back in the bag now. Dinner proceeded with formal military courtesy, but as the meal progressed, the atmosphere gradually relaxed. Thomas found himself fielding careful questions about operations, long past answering what he could while respecting the classifications that still applied. Is it true that Foxhole Alpha developed the maritime infiltration technique that became standard for SEAL operations in the 80s? A commander asked. Thomas considered his answer carefully. What became standard was a refined version. The original was less comfortable. We didn't have the equipment you have today. We improvised. With respect, sir, a younger officer ventured, why have you never come forward? Your contributions to naval special warfare are incalculable. Thomas set down his fork. White died protecting operational security. Mendez carried shrapnel in his leg until the day he passed. Countless others gave everything. What right did I have to claim recognition when they couldn't? He shook his head. Besides, the work was its own reward. Always has been. The answer silenced the room momentarily, each officer confronting the simple humility of the man before them. As coffee was served, Admiral Richardson broached the subject that had been hanging over the gathering. Chief, regarding the incident today, what would you recommend we do with those recruits? All eyes turned to Thomas, curious about his response. You're asking me? Thomas raised an eyebrow. I'm just a groundskeeper these days. Richardson smiled slightly. I think we both know you're more than that. Thomas considered the question. Don't kick them out, he said finally. Start them over. From day one, and add something to their training. Have them research the history they were so quick to dismiss. Make them understand what came before them, what they are aspiring to join. The Admiral nodded thoughtfully. A fitting response. As the dinner concluded, Captain Anderson approached with an unexpected proposal. Chief Reeves, we'd like to formalize your position here, not as a groundskeeper, but as an advisor to the SEAL training program. Thomas looked surprised. I'm 84 years old, Captain, and possess knowledge and experience that shouldn't be lost, Anderson countered. We're not asking you to run obstacle courses, just to share your wisdom, your perspective. Thomas glanced around the room at the earnest faces of men dedicated to the same principles that had guided his life. He thought of Collins and the other young recruits so eager to prove themselves without truly understanding what they were proving. I'll consider it, he said finally. On one condition, I keep my gardens. The Marigolds don't care about my service record. This drew genuine laughter from the assembled officers. Anderson nodded. I think we can accommodate that, sir. Later that night, as Thomas walked back to his quarters under a blanket of stars, he paused to look out over the Pacific. The same ocean he had crossed so many times on classified missions, the same waters that had been both battlefield and sanctuary throughout his career. The confrontation with Collins seemed distant now, almost trivial in the grand scheme of his life. Yet something about the young man's arrogance and subsequent shame had stirred memories Thomas had long kept submerged. Perhaps there was value in bringing those memories to the surface, in sharing the hard-earned lessons they contained. As he continued walking, Thomas became aware of a figure standing in the shadows ahead. As he drew closer, he recognized Collins still in his training uniform, despite the late hour. Recruit, Thomas acknowledged, stopping a few paces away. Shouldn't you be in your barracks? Collins straightened. Yes, sir. I was hoping to catch you before you turned in. He hesitated. I wanted to thank you, sir, for what you said earlier, and for not ending my career today. Thomas studied the young man's face, seeing genuine contrition and something else, hunger for redemption. Your career isn't saved yet, Collins. You've got a long road ahead. I know, sir. We start over tomorrow, Hell Week all over again. Despite the daunting prospect, Collins didn't sound defeated. But I'll make it through. I understand better now what I'm working toward. Thomas nodded, hearing something promising in the recruit's voice. We'll see. He started to move past, then paused. Get some rest, Collins. Tomorrow will be harder than you think. As Thomas continued to his quarters, he felt a curious lightness in his chest. For decades, he had carried the weight of his experiences alone, the stories untold, the lessons unshared. Perhaps it was time to set that burden down, to pass what he knew to a new generation. The Marigolds would still be there tomorrow, waiting for his care. But now perhaps there were other seeds to plant as well. In the darkness of his small base housing unit, Thomas opened a footlocker that had traveled with him for 60 years. Inside, beneath carefully folded memorabilia, lay a leather-bound journal. Its pages contained the unclassified portions of his experiences, written in the spare, precise handwriting of a man accustomed to mission reports. Thomas had begun the journal after White's death, a way to ensure that his friend's sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. Over the years, it had become a record of Foxhole Alpha's contributions, names, and dates, carefully obscured, but the lessons preserved. He had never intended anyone else to read it. Now he wasn't so sure. Perhaps its contents might help shape young men like Collins into the kind of warriors the nation would always need, skilled, yes, but also humble, mindful of those who had come before, and above all, loyal to their brothers. Thomas closed the footlocker, decision made. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for him and for Collins. The young recruit would face the physical trial of beginning Bud's training again. Thomas would face the more complex challenge of opening doors long kept closed, of revisiting a past both glorious and painful. As he prepared for bed, Thomas glanced at his reflection in the small bathroom mirror. The faded tattoo caught the light, a reminder of promises made and kept. White and Mendez were gone now, but the seal with its trident remained a tangible link to men who had become more than teammates. They had become brothers. Still here, boys, Thomas murmured to the reflection, still keeping the promise. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the garden. The early morning mist clung to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado as a group of SEAL candidates struggled through their physical training. Among them was Ryan Collins, his face etched with determination, rather than the arrogance that had once defined him. The training had been brutal. After Admiral Richardson's decision, Collins and his two friends had been recycled to the very beginning of Bud's training. Every grueling evolution, every sleepless night, every cold water immersion, all experienced a second time, but now with the added weight of redemption hanging over them. Collins pushed through another set of push-ups muscles, burning uniforms soaked with sweat and seawater. The instructor bellowed orders, demanding more, and always more. But something had changed in Collins. The suffering no longer seemed like an obstacle to overcome for personal glory. It had become a path to understanding. Across the base, Thomas Reeves sat in a small classroom surrounded by training materials and historical documents. In the months since his identity had been revealed, the base had established a new program called Legacy Lessons. Every SEAL candidate was now required to study the history of naval special warfare, to understand the sacrifices and innovations of those who had come before. Thomas had reluctantly accepted a position as special advisor to the training command. He still tended his gardens. In the mornings he had been adamant about that, but his afternoons were devoted to ensuring that the legacy of Foxhole Alpha and other pioneering units was properly understood. He looked up as Captain Anderson entered the classroom, closing the door behind him. "How's it coming along, Chief?" Anderson asked, surveying the materials spread across the desk. Thomas gestured to a stack of declassified operation reports. "Slowly, there's a fine line between teaching these boys their history and giving away operational methods that might still be relevant." Anderson nodded understanding. "Admiral Richardson has authorized the declassification of 3 more Foxhole Alpha operations for training purposes. The ones you recommended." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Even Petropavlovsk?" "Even that one," Anderson confirmed. "He feels the tactical innovations are too valuable not to share, even if some of the geopolitical aspects remain sensitive." Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. "The boys will appreciate that, especially Collins. He's been digging through everything he can find about the unit." "Speaking of Collins," Anderson said, "his instructor says he's showing remarkable improvement, not just physically, but in his approach to teamwork and leadership." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "Good. The boy has potential. He just needed to understand what this is really all about." He tapped the faded tattoo on his forearm. "Not glory, brotherhood." Later that day, Collins sat alone in the base library, surrounded by books and printouts. His assigned research project on the history of naval special warfare had become something of an obsession. What had begun as punishment had transformed into a genuine quest for understanding. He turned a page in a recently declassified report, eyes widening at what he read. The document detailed a 1962 operation codenamed Marlin Spike, in which a 3-man Foxhole Alpha team had infiltrated a Soviet naval facility during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The team leader was identified only as Operative NE in the report, but Collins knew from his research that NE stood for Night Eagle, Thomas Reeves's operational call sign. The report described how the team had spent 3 days in near-freezing water, gathering intelligence on Soviet submarine capabilities that would prove crucial during the tense standoff. What struck Collins most was a paragraph near the end. "Despite suffering from severe hypothermia and a laceration to his left leg, Operative NE refused extraction until both team members were secured. When secondary swimmer ME lost consciousness due to cold exposure, NE towed him for 3.7 nautical miles to the extraction point, maintaining communications security throughout." Collins sat back, trying to imagine the scene. The freezing black water, the weight of an unconscious teammate, the knowledge that discovery meant certain death or imprisonment, all while maintaining absolute silence and navigating through hostile waters. "Finding anything interesting?" Collins startled at the voice, looking up to find Thomas Reeves standing beside his table, regarding him with those penetrating blue eyes. Sir Collins scrambled to his feet, standing at attention. "Yes, sir, I was just reading about Operation Marlin Spike." Thomas glanced at the report and nodded. "Ah, cold few days those were." The casual understatement was so profound that Collins almost smiled. "Sir, the report says you towed your teammate nearly 4 miles in freezing water." Thomas shrugged slightly. "Mendez would have done the same for me." He pulled out a chair and sat, gesturing for Collins to do the same. "How's the training going, son?" Collins sank back into his seat. "Honestly, sir, harder the second time around. Not physically, but—" he struggled to find the words. "Mentally," Thomas finished for him. Because now you know what's at stake. It's not just about proving yourself anymore. Yes, sir, exactly. Collins hesitated, then pushed forward. Sir, I've been wanting to ask you something about White. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. What about him? In your story, you said you went back for him alone against orders. Collins leaned forward. Why you'd already risked everything to get Mendez out? Why go back in? Thomas was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the table, completely still. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, touched with an old pain. When we formed Foxhole Alpha, we made a promise to each other. That's what the tattoo represents. Not just a unit insignia, but a vow. He tapped his forearm gently. We all come home, no matter what. But he was already dead when you found him, Collins said softly. Yes, but the promise wasn't just to bring each other home alive. It was to bring each other home, period. No one left behind, not even to be buried in foreign soil. Thomas's gaze drifted to the middle distance. White had a wife, 2 young daughters. They deserved to bury their father properly, not wonder forever what had happened to him. Collins absorbed this, seeing new depths to the man before him. The report doesn't mention that part, he said. No, some things don't belong in official records. Thomas refocused on Collins. Which brings me to why I came looking for you. Captain Anderson tells me you're scheduled to give a presentation on Foxhole Alpha next week. Collins nodded. Yes, sir, part of my disciplinary requirements. I'd like to attend, Thomas said simply. Collins felt a surge of both pride and trepidation. I'd be honored, sir, but I'm not sure my presentation would tell you anything you don't already know. Thomas smiled slightly. I'm not coming to learn, Collins. I'm coming to see what you have learned. 1 week later, the base auditorium was packed with SEAL trainees, instructors, and various officers. Word had spread that Thomas Reeves would be attending, and no one wanted to miss the opportunity to see the living legend in the same room as the recruit who had once mocked him. Collins stood at the podium, no longer the cocky young man who had harassed an elderly gardener. 6 months of renewed training and intensive historical research had transformed him. His body was leaner, his eyes more focused, his demeanor more measured. He had just finished setting up his presentation when the room suddenly quieted. Thomas Reeves entered through a side door accompanied by Captain Anderson. The entire audience rose to their feet in respect, but Thomas waved them down with an embarrassed gesture. He took a seat in the back row, nodding encouragingly to Collins. The young recruit swallowed hard, then began. Good morning, I'm Recruit Collins, and today I'll be presenting my research on Foxhole Alpha, the classified precursor to modern naval special warfare. As Collins spoke, his initial nervousness gave way to genuine enthusiasm. He outlined the formation of the unit in 1952, described their specialized training, and detailed several key operations that had shaped future SEAL tactics. Throughout the presentation, he was careful to focus not just on the operational aspects, but on the men themselves. He spoke of their innovations born of necessity, their brotherhood forged in extreme conditions, and their commitment to mission accomplishment and team preservation. What distinguished Foxhole Alpha, Collins said approaching the conclusion of his talk, wasn't just their tactical prowess or physical endurance. It was their fundamental understanding that the strength of the unit lay in their commitment to each other. He clicked to his final slide, which showed a simple hand-drawn sketch of a SEAL clutching a trident. This insignia wasn't created by some Pentagon committee. It was drawn by Operator Franklin White one night in an Alaskan barracks. It represented a promise between teammates. We all come home, no matter what. Collins paused, gathering his courage for what came next. And that promise wasn't just words. On August 17, 1970, during Operation Silent Tide in the Arabian Sea, that promise was tested when White was captured by enemy forces. Despite having already completed a dangerous extraction of an injured teammate and against direct orders, Operator Thomas Reeves returned to enemy territory alone to fulfill that promise. A murmur ran through the audience. Many heads turned toward the back of the room where Thomas sat, his expression unreadable. Reeves succeeded in recovering White's body, ensuring his brother would return home to his family. Collins's voice grew softer. That, gentlemen, is the true meaning of never leave a man behind. Not a slogan, a sacred obligation. Collins looked directly at Thomas now, And that obligation doesn't just extend to the battlefield. It extends across time to honoring those who came before us, whose sacrifices made our opportunity possible. He straightened, squaring his shoulders. The men of Foxhole Alpha didn't fight for recognition. Most of their operations remain classified even today. They didn't fight for glory or medals or to prove themselves the toughest men in the room. They fought for their country, for their mission, and above all, for each other. Collins clicked to his last slide, which simply read, "This isn't ancient history, it's our foundation." "Thank you," he concluded quietly. The auditorium erupted in applause. Officers and trainees alike rose to their feet in a standing ovation, not just for Collins's presentation, but for the principles he had articulated and the man sitting quietly in the back row who had lived them. As the crowd began to disperse following the presentation, Collins found himself surrounded by fellow trainees, instructors, and officers all offering congratulations on his talk. He accepted their praise with a new humility, aware of how much he still had to learn. Eventually, the crowd thinned, and Collins saw Thomas speaking with Admiral Richardson near the exit. He hesitated, uncertain whether to approach, when Thomas caught his eye and beckoned him over. "Admiral," Thomas said as Collins joined them, "this is the young man I was telling you about." Admiral Richardson studied Collins with evaluating eyes. "Impressive presentation, recruit. You seem to have taken your lessons to heart." "Thank you, sir," Collins replied. "I've had excellent teachers." Richardson nodded and turned to Thomas. "The offer stands, Chief, whenever you're ready." With that cryptic statement, the Admiral departed, leaving Collins alone with Thomas. "What offer was that, sir?" Collins asked. Thomas smiled slightly. "The Admiral wants to formalize my position here. Make me an official advisor to the SEAL training program." "That's great news, sir," Collins said enthusiastically. "The program needs your knowledge." "Perhaps," Thomas conceded, "but I told him I had one condition." He fixed Collins with those penetrating blue eyes. "I want you as my assistant when you complete your training." Collins stared at him in shock. "Me, but sir, after what I did—" "Is exactly why it should be you," Thomas interrupted. "You understand better than most what this is really about now, and you have a gift for communicating it to others." He clapped Collins on the shoulder. "Think about it. You've still got plenty of training to complete before you have to decide." As spring turned to summer, the Legacy Lessons program expanded. Thomas supervised the development of a comprehensive curriculum that integrated the history and principles of naval special warfare into every aspect of SEAL training. The garden outside the barracks bloomed with marigolds, tended now not just by Thomas, but by a rotation of recruits who considered it an honor to work alongside the legendary operator. Collins continued his training, pushing through each evolution with a newfound purpose. The instructors noted the change, how he now helped struggling teammates rather than competing against them, how he approached each challenge with grim determination rather than showy bravado. One scorching July afternoon, the current Buds class was engaged in a particularly grueling boat drill. Teams of candidates struggled to carry heavy inflatable boats over their heads while running through soft sand. Collins's team was falling behind one of their members, clearly at the edge of his endurance. As instructors barked for them to pick up the pace, Collins made a decision. He shifted position, taking more of the boat's weight onto his own shoulders, creating a momentary reprieve for his struggling teammate. "Stay with us, Davis," he said through gritted teeth. "We finish together." From the sidelines, Thomas watched the scene unfold. Captain Anderson stood beside him, both men shielded from the relentless sun by the brim of their covers. "Your boy Collins gets it now," Anderson observed. Thomas nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "He does." "The Admiral's approved your full proposal," Anderson continued. "Starting next cycle, every SEAL candidate will complete a history rotation and practical ethics course before graduation." "Good," Thomas said simply. "They need to understand they're not just joining a unit, they're inheriting a legacy." Anderson glanced at the old operator. "You know, when all this started 6 months ago, I thought you might want revenge on Collins. Make an example of him." Thomas chuckled softly. "Revenge is for people with too much time on their hands and not enough perspective, Captain." He nodded toward the struggling boat crew. "Look at him now. That lesson was worth more than any punishment." Later that evening, Thomas sat on the small porch of his base housing unit watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. He held a worn leather journal in his hands, its pages filled with decades of memories, written in the economical style of a military man. A knock at his door pulled him from his contemplation. He tucked the journal aside and rose to answer it. Collins stood there still in his training uniform, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Collins," Thomas greeted him. "Come in." The young recruit stepped inside, glancing around at the Spartan quarters. The walls were mostly bare save for a single framed photograph showing three young men in naval uniforms, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grins wide beneath their white covers. "Sir, I wanted to ask you something," Collins said after Thomas had offered him a seat and a glass of water. "Today, during boat drills, I made a choice that slowed our team down, but kept us together. The instructors didn't seem happy." Thomas settled into his own chair. "And you're wondering if you did the right thing?" "Yes, sir." "Tell me something, Collins. If you had been on a real operation, would you have left that man behind to complete the mission faster?" Collins considered this seriously. "It would depend on the mission, sir. If lives were at stake, if time was critical, maybe, but I'd try to find another way first." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's the calculation we all have to make. Sometimes the mission demands sacrifice. But a good leader always looks for the third option, the one that accomplishes the mission without abandoning his men." He reached for his journal and opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Let me tell you about Operation Kingfisher, December 1962, the Barents Sea." For the next hour, Thomas shared the story of a mission that had nearly ended in disaster when ice conditions had trapped a Foxhole Alpha team during exfiltration, how they had improvised a solution that seemed suicidal, but ultimately saved both the mission and the team. Collins listened intently, absorbing not just the tactical lessons, but the underlying principles: adaptability, teamwork, refusing to accept a no-win scenario. As Thomas concluded his story, Collins noticed something he hadn't before: a small model ship on a nearby shelf. It was a Soviet submarine, meticulously detailed, despite its small size. "Is that," he began, "the Cachalot-class submarine we infiltrated?" "Yes." Thomas smiled at Collins's surprised expression. "A little reminder, the instructors have their methods, Collins. But out in the real world, the rules sometimes change. Trust your training, but also trust your instincts." 2 months later, the SEAL training compound buzzed with activity. A graduation ceremony was being prepared, marking the completion of Bud's training for a new class of potential SEALs. Among the graduates would be Collins and his two friends who had successfully completed their recycled training. In a small ceremony room adjacent to the main hall, Admiral Richardson presided over another more private event. Thomas Reeves stood at attention wearing a freshly pressed service uniform with his original rank insignia of Chief Petty Officer. Before him, Richardson held open a small case containing a Navy Cross, the second highest decoration awarded for valor in combat. "Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reeves," Richardson read formally, "for extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy during Operation Silent Tide, August 1970. Despite grievous personal risk and contrary to direct orders, Chief Reeves returned to hostile territory alone to recover a fallen teammate, maintaining the sacred covenant that no American warrior be left behind in enemy hands." The small audience, consisting only of Captain Anderson and a few senior officers with sufficient security clearance, watched solemnly as Richardson pinned the long overdue medal to Thomas's chest. "The President of the United States has authorized this award in recognition of your valor and devotion to your fellow servicemen," Richardson concluded. "It is presented with the gratitude of a nation." Thomas stood rigid, accepting the honor with the same quiet dignity with which he had performed the actions that earned it. When invited to speak, he said only, "I accept this on behalf of Carlos Mendez and Franklin White, without whom I would not be standing here today." The formality of the moment was broken when Richardson surprised everyone by pulling Thomas into a brief embrace. "Long overdue, Chief," he said quietly. "White and Mendez would be proud." After the ceremony, Thomas made his way to the main graduation event. He slipped into the back of the auditorium just as the proceedings began, content to observe from a distance. One by one, the graduates received their tridents, the coveted SEAL insignia that marked their entry into the elite brotherhood. When Collins's name was called, Thomas felt an unexpected surge of pride. The young man who had once mocked an old man's tattoo now stood tall, accepting his trident with appropriate solemnity. In just 6 months, Collins had transformed from an arrogant recruit into a thoughtful operator who understood the weight of the legacy he was inheriting. After the ceremony, amid the celebration and photographs, Collins broke away from his classmates when he spotted Thomas at the edge of the crowd. He approached and came to attention, rendering a perfect salute. "Chief Reeves," he said formally, "thank you for attending, sir." Thomas returned the salute with precision that belied his age. "Congratulations, Collins, you've earned it." Collins lowered his arm, his expression earnest. "Sir, I've been thinking about your offer to work with you on the legacy program after my specialized training. And I'd be honored, sir, if the offer still stands." Thomas nodded, pleased. "It does. Report to me when you complete your advanced training." He hesitated, then added, "I'm proud of you, son. You've come a long way." The simple words of approval seemed to affect Collins deeply. He swallowed hard before responding. "Thank you, sir. That means more than the trident." 1 year later, the SEAL training compound had undergone significant changes. A new building stood adjacent to the main training facility, its entrance marked with a simple plaque, Foxhole Alpha Heritage Center. Inside, carefully curated exhibits told the story of the evolution of naval special warfare, with particular emphasis on the pioneering units that had laid the groundwork for modern capabilities. Thomas, now 85, moved more slowly but remained sharp as ever. His official title was Senior Advisor for Heritage and Ethics, but the trainees simply called him the Founder, with reverent tones. Each morning still found him tending the gardens that now extended around the entire training compound, often accompanied by recruits who used the opportunity to absorb his quiet wisdom. Collins, having completed his specialized training with distinction, now served as Thomas's primary assistant. Together, they had developed a comprehensive program that integrated historical knowledge and ethical decision-making into every aspect of SEAL training. On a crisp October morning, Thomas and Collins walked the grounds inspecting the latest garden additions. Thomas moved carefully with the aid of a walking stick, his body finally beginning to show the effects of his extraordinary life. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as they paused near a bench overlooking the training beach. "It's time to complete the circle." Collins glanced at him curiously. "Sir." Thomas lowered himself onto the bench, gesturing for Collins to join him. "When White designed our insignia back in '52, we all promised to get it tattooed when we completed training. It was more than just ink, it was a bond." He rolled up his sleeves, slightly revealing the faded tattoo that had started everything a year and a half ago. "Mendez and White are gone now. I'm the last one carrying this mark." Collins listened attentively, sensing the importance of what Thomas was saying. "The legacy program is working," Thomas continued. "The new candidates understand their history now. They respect what came before. But I've been wondering about what happens after I'm gone." "Sir, you've documented everything," Collins assured him. "The program is established, the curriculum is set. Your legacy is secure." Thomas shook his head slightly. "Paper burns. Programs change. Bureaucracy forgets." He fixed Collins with that penetrating gaze. "But symbols endure." Understanding dawned in Collins's eyes. "You want me to get the tattoo?" "Not exactly," Thomas clarified. "I want you to consider creating a new tradition. Not identical to ours, you'll have your own symbol, your own meaning, but something that carries forward the essence of what Foxhole Alpha stood for." Collins thought about this, turning the idea over in his mind. A brotherhood within the brotherhood. A commitment to the highest standards of the SEAL ethos. "Exactly." Thomas nodded, satisfaction in his voice. "Something that can't be taken away by changing political winds or budget cuts. Something that lives in the hearts and minds of the operators themselves." 5 years later, a small group gathered at Arlington National Cemetery. The day was clear but cold, typical for early December in Virginia. A military honor guard stood at attention as a flag-draped casket was positioned for interment. Commander Ryan Collins, now a seasoned SEAL officer, stood with the mourners. Beside him, aging but still imposing in their dress uniforms, were Admiral Richardson and Captain Anderson, both now retired. Behind them, a contingent of SEAL operators from multiple generations formed a solemn assembly. The chaplain spoke of service, sacrifice, and legacy, of a life dedicated to principles greater than self, of quiet heroism that asked for no recognition but deserved the highest honors. As the ceremony concluded and the honor guard folded the flag with precise movements, Collins stepped forward to receive it. He accepted the triangle of fabric with reverence, then moved to the edge of the gathering, where an elderly woman in a wheelchair waited, her white hair caught by the winter breeze. "Mrs. White," Cullen said softly, kneeling before her, "on behalf of a grateful nation and the men of Foxhole Alpha and Naval Special Warfare Command, I present you with this flag in honor of Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reeves." Sarah White, now in her 90s and the widow of Franklin White, reached out with trembling hands to accept the flag. "He kept his promise," she said, tears in her faded eyes. "He brought Frank home, and now they're together again." Collins nodded, his own eyes misting. "Yes, ma'am, they all came home." Later, as the mourners dispersed, Collins remained at the gravesite. Thomas Reeves would rest here alongside his Foxhole Alpha brothers Mendez and White, reunited in death, as they had been bonded in life. Collins rolled up his sleeve slightly, revealing a tattoo on his forearm. It was not identical to the one Thomas had carried. This was a modern interpretation, cleaner lines, more detailed. But the fundamental image remained a seal clutching a trident. Beneath it, in simple block letters, "Honor never fades." He was not alone in carrying this mark. Throughout the SEAL teams, a small but growing number of operators had embraced the tradition Collins had established. They called themselves Guardians of the Threshold, a reference to something Thomas had once said about the original meaning of the Foxhole Alpha insignia. Each Guardian committed to upholding the highest standards of the SEAL ethos, to preserving the history and traditions of those who had come before, and above all, to never leaving a brother behind, whether on the battlefield or in life. As Collins prepared to leave, he noticed a young SEAL lieutenant standing nearby paying his respects. "Sir," the lieutenant said, approaching with respect. "Did you know him well?" Collins smiled slightly. "I did. He taught me what it really means to wear the trident." He studied the younger man. "Did you?" The lieutenant shook his head. "I only met him once during legacy training, but that one conversation changed how I viewed everything." He hesitated. "Is it true what they say, that he went back alone for a fallen teammate against direct orders?" "It's true," Collins confirmed. "Thomas Reeves never left anyone behind. Not on the mission, not in training, not in life." He gazed at the fresh grave. "And now it's our job to carry that forward." "The tattoo," the lieutenant said, noticing Collins's forearm. "I've seen others with it. What does it mean?" Collins considered how to answer, remembering Thomas's words from years ago. Not just about being the best or about proving oneself, about something deeper and more enduring. "It means we understand that we're not just operators," Collins explained. "We're inheritors of a legacy. It means we hold ourselves to the highest standard, not because someone's watching, but because that's who we are. And it means we never forget where we came from or those who made our path possible." The lieutenant nodded thoughtfully. "How does someone earn the right to wear it?" Collins smiled. "It starts with understanding the history, really understanding it." He gestured toward the administrative building visible in the distance. "Come by my office tomorrow. We'll talk." As they walked away from the gravesite, Collins cast one final glance back. In his mind's eye, he could still see Thomas kneeling in that garden bed, quietly tending his marigolds, while carrying the weight of history on his shoulders. "Pride is a heavy anchor," Thomas had said that day so long ago. "It can hold you steady in a storm, or it can drag you straight to the bottom. The trick is knowing which it's doing." Collins had learned that lesson well, and now it was his turn to pass it on, to ensure that Thomas Reeves's legacy, like the man himself, would never fade away, but would continue to shape generations of warriors yet to come. In the quiet cemetery, as the winter sun began its early descent, 3 headstones stood side by side: Carlos Mendez, Franklin White, and now Thomas Reeves. Together again, the men of Foxhole Alpha. Brothers in life, brothers in death. Their physical presence was gone, but their spirit lived on in every operator who understood that true strength came not from individual prowess, but from unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. And on Collins's arm, as on a growing number throughout the SEAL teams, the seal with its trident stood as silent testimony to a promise kept across generations: honor never fades.